Okay, well, we're gonna get started with coffee with the founder. I got my coffee cup here, which is required, and then I got man, one of the homies that's been supporting me since I had hair back in the day, and really excited to have Dr. Darron Smith here, and we're gonna get rolling because we have so much to talk about. Morning, Doc. How you
Good
doing?
morning. I'm doing fine. Eddie Moore, Dr. Morris, great to see you. It's been a long time. I want to tell you that I like the hair. I like you without the hair. It looks better on you. You wear it well. As you can see, mine's doing a backflip too.
Yeah, I see
And I
that.
just leave it alone. I just leave
Yeah,
it alone at that point.
yeah, that shine is fine if you ask me.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, I don't know you. Let's say I meet you on an elevator. I meet you somewhere shopping. How would you introduce yourself? Who are you? What is it that you do? What's your expertise? What's your research? Help our listeners understand who is Dr. Darron Smith.
My name is Darron Smith, and this is always the worst part. Maybe you have to talk about yourself. I am originally from Nashville, Tennessee, but I was raised in Southern California. And early part of my life, I lived in Nashville, graduated from high school in Nashville, then went back out west with my family as they moved back out west. So I'm kind of an in betweener. I'm kind of Southern on the one hand, but yet I'm Californian on the other. I claim California is my hood, and Nashville is a distant second. So in saying that, I did all my educational work out west at the University of Utah, was where I did my PhD and where I went to PA school, physician assistant school. So in addition to being a scholarly type brother, I'm also a medically trained brother. My area of expertise is child and adolescent psychiatry. So I do a lot of assessments on young children who have various types of mental health disorders, ranging from learning disabilities all the way to autism spectrum disorder. So and everything in between. So that's kind of what I do professionally when I'm not uh, engaging students or engaged in research. I'm also working in child adolescent psychiatry, where a focus of my research is in that particular domain as well. And we'll talk about that later if we have time to come back to what I'm doing uh, currently in that realm as a researcher, to find out ways to help Black folks and people who have been traumatized deal with the fallout of being exposed to trauma or having some genetic predisposition toward trauma, and living in an environment where trauma is rife. So I do a lot of work on that, particularly how to tune the brain, how to work on the brain, how to tune it up, how to get it more optimal for those who are struggling with a variety of disorders. So that's one of the things that I do. Now, my dissertation project, when I way back when I published a study looking at transracial adoption, white parents raising Black children, and their experiences, the children's experiences in these family environments, as well as the parents and their experiences raising Black children, because this is a new experience for them as well. So and the intersections in between. So I've spent a lot of time looking at that. As well, and then a number of things. I've written a couple of books. Uh, I wish my shits would blow up like some of these other cats on, Kendi and some of these other cats. But one can only hope. But two books: one looking at transracial adoption, the process of white parents raising children, and the struggles that they have in that family dynamic, as well as a book I published on sports called "When Race, Religion, and Sport Collide: Blacks at BYU and Beyond," looking at Black athletes who went to BYU and who were caught in the system of what's called the revolving door. They come in, they're exploited for their labor power, and then they're out. Especially when they start messing with them little gals up there, then they get the ixnay.
Mm.
So talking to them and their experiences, and then that's about it, man. Just trying to you know, stay relevant in a very difficult time in our history as a nation, and to try to, do what I do and bring some good cheer to those who are open to such messages of transformation. Because essentially, what this is about is transforming society and making it making the America live up to her promise. Its promise. It's not been a rosy journey for folks of color and those who have been on the fringes of society. So my job is to sort of bring some clarity to it in hopes of bringing some transformative change. So what you're doing, Eddie, is incredibly important in terms of that transformative push to get people to be awake, alert, relaxed, and focused, and to be able to control their reactions and their emotions, to be in control of those things. We used to believe before that people couldn't master that. People couldn't master their emotions to be able to gain some sort of control over them, but they can. And it's not just a science fiction tale anymore. We know that we have the capacity to do that. And one of the ways that I've been trying to sort of work on this is to sort of understand the sort of biological processes going on inside the brain, which enables people who are experiencing stress and trauma to be able to pause, recognize the feelings that they have inside their body, and then to be able to make the appropriate changes that they need to be whole and to be healthy, to have a sense of well-being, to be able to live on this earth much longer than what it seems to be taking people's lives precipitously every day. People are dying from diseases of what's called diseases of despair, where they don't have enough the things that make us human, the things that helped us survive. Our species survive. Homo sapiens survive for thousands of years, is our ability to cooperate and work together, to be able to build complex societies, to be able to have the opportunity to have a clique, tribe, clan, or family, as we call it in the modern society, modern day. To be able to have the access to these things, our species has always longed for, wanting to be relevant, wanting to feel loved, wanting to feel accepted by those who we care for, which is one of the most difficult stressors one can face. If one is ostracized or one is undermined or marginalized by larger social systems in place, cultural racism, if you will, has a very, very corrosive effect upon our physical and our mental health. So that's what I've been doing, man. I've been trying to put all this race stuff I've been doing over the years and then put it into a box and say, okay, all this race stuff I've done, so what? It's the so what question. You got a lot of knowledge about race, so what do you do with it? So I've been focusing on healing, trying to work on healing and trying to foster optimal functioning in the midst of incredible suffering that people experience given the circumstances of being Black and living in a society where race has always been a part of that landscape. So that's what I've been trying to do. Don't know if I'm doing it well, but I'm certainly trying to do that.
Yeah, it sounds like a tall task, a tall order. As I know, you've been at it a while, and what we like about what we're doing at the White Privilege Conference, the Privilege Institute, particularly the folks who are there participating, supporting, they're not just writing for writing's sake or speaking for popularity's sake. They're going back to their neighborhoods, communities, and doing the work. And so that's what I appreciate about and have always appreciated about you is you don't just talk it on the stage, you're doing it in the places and spaces where you operate. So now you're in Memphis. What are some of the challenges there that you're seeing that may be different from the other places you've been, particularly as it relates to this issue of trauma, folks of color, Black folks specifically, but especially young people? Is the South, so to speak, different than what you experienced out west in Utah?
Absolutely. I want to say that Blackness does not look the same. It's not a monolithic experience. That Blackness looks different depending on where you are. If you grew up in Ohio and you Black, your Blackness may look different if you grew up in Mississippi versus California. So the Black experience down here in Memphis is, they call Memphis the biggest city in Mississippi, because we really are at the crossroads here in this area. This is the Southern Delta. This is the home of the Delta Blues. This is the home of course, King was assassinated in this region, and Memphis has had a long history of racial foibles over the last several decades. Memphis was one of the first cities that was captured by the Union Army. It became a refuge for runaway slaves who fled their masters in the Delta regions around this area. It was a very strategic capture because they had access to the Mississippi River to get supplies up and down the river to supply rebel forces. So Memphis became a hotbed of racial animus during this time in our history around the 18th century, 1800s. And so it started there. And most of the Blacks that fled to Memphis to flee oppression and the pangs of slavery came here because the Union Army had a large contingency of Black soldiers here. So there was a modicum of protection here with the Union Army. And so most Blacks that fled to Memphis ended up in South Memphis, North Memphis are the areas where most Blacks live in the city. We have a very high poverty rate here. I think it's 20% or more in the city. So, and much of that poverty is Black poverty. And with Black poverty comes a host of other social factors that sort of culminate to make the experiences of being Black in the city, if you're poor, much more grinding, much more toxic, much more conducive to disease. And what kind of diseases generally are we talking about in this region? We're talking to typical usual suspects, diseases of lifestyle-related diseases, which is why COVID is such a major issue, because it's not a lifestyle-related disease. It's a virus that's contracted through contact, aerosolized contact. But in talking about the city of Memphis, we have a fairly robust crime problem here, but I think that's true in any urban city where you have a lot of blight and a lot of inequality. Because of the historical formation of the city and the fact that it was used as a refuge for runaway slaves, there's a lot of generational issues associated with that. You've got poverty, you've got intergenerational trauma, people who have come out of their ancestors at least, who came out of slavery, who fled slavery to this region. Not only they brought their bodies with them, but their genes were transformed by the experience of slavery. And what I mean by that is because people will go through such horrors and experience the difficulties of living under bondage, it creates a very insecure brain, so that the brain of an individual who is traumatized, who lives in a region like Memphis, or it could be LA, it could be Riverside County, it could be wherever it is. It could be the barrio, it could be, urban areas, it could even be rural America, areas where people are generally left out and left behind. And that's the vast majority of the people that we see today who are living in these cities, who are struggling to have their share of the so-called American dream. I always say that if you want the American dream, you probably want to go to Norway or Sweden or Finland, because you have a better chance of getting that than you do here. Because certainly the United States is not a state that allows for that kind of group uplift. Society's uplifting its citizens, providing its citizens with the necessary support they need to survive, just to be able to have a living wage, to be able to have a shot at or a place at the table, if you will. When people are left out and left behind, the consequences of that to the human condition is large and wide. So Memphis has its problems. We have a shitty school system here. We have Shelby County Schools is one of the worst school districts in the country. It's got to be. If it's not, it's got to be on the top 10. In terms of funding, in terms of teachers and having access to teachers, in terms of parent-teacher student participation is low. Parents are working hard but not getting anywhere. These children who are in the city. A lot of these kids have developmental traumas. They were exposed to things when they were young that again transform their brains, making them very insecure. And the insecurities can be seen in things like ADHD, ADD, or depression, childhood anxiety, these kinds of things. I generally see this in kids who have experienced trauma, who've gone through experiences in their families where they've been abused, the typical abuse processes, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and what have you. But also it's the insecurity that's generated when a child doesn't know that their parent is going to be there for them when they need them the most during these early formative years. And so we see a lot of that here, a lot of wayward kids in the city. And so being here has really been it's interesting for me to be here, because when I was in Utah, it was nothing like that in Utah. Now Utah did have its hood, but the hood is nothing like the hood here. It's entirely different. It's much more of a sanitized hood in Utah as opposed to it here in Memphis, which is more on the grimier side, simply because people here, because of the history of the state, the history of the city of Memphis, the money that flows into Memphis, the amount of help that's given, or the amount of programs that are put forward. I know Republicans who are listening to us may not like the fact that we're talking about, welfare state. Oh my God, please. He said welfare state. You're gonna run off half the listeners saying that if they are of that particular political persuasion. We do tend to see some correlation between people's political persuasion and the notion of a welfare state, even though those people with those particular political persuasions are benefiting from the welfare state. Don't get me started on that. About 40% of white people are on welfare, okay, as opposed to maybe 20, maybe 25, 30% of blacks and Hispanics. So white folks make up the vast majority of those who are using welfare and CHIP and other services. And they're the very ones who are complaining about it, complaining about no government help, while at the same time taking the government help that's being given to them. So the misinformation and that's out there, the degree of ignorance that I see in the world, including my city here in Memphis, is incredible. And you wonder why people, act a fool when during times of crisis, or they don't know how else to respond to the circumstances surrounding their lives and their families' lives. So buffoonery becomes a strategy to deal with the reality of living in such dire situations. So and let's not get it twisted. Just because I'm African American, highfalutin, so-called scholar and all, am I somehow exempt from experiencing racism? Hell no. Nobody doesn't know. When they look at me, they don't see any of that. They see potentially a scary black man, and I'm aware of that. Everywhere I go, I try to be mindful of. But does it bog me down? No. It used to frighten me, actually, when I was a little younger. I used to be kind of tripped out by people's ignorance. But as I began to learn and understand the history of this country, then the fear went away, and I call it the prophetic fire sort of emerged within me. I think the same thing. I think I've seen you do the same thing too, Eddie, over the years. With the issue with the white privilege conference, the things that you've been doing for the decades that I've known you, is partly because of prophetic fire, feeling a need to make a difference, feeling a need to make changes. Now, listen, while y'all talking about me, talk about this brother here and what this brother's done. I followed this brother for years while he was working on his PhD. Followed him for years when he's working in Washington, D.C. with children in Washington, D.C. and Washington State. Followed him when he moved to New York and did similarly there, and all the wonderful things he's done to give voice to the notion of privilege, white privilege. Although, Eddie, I would easily argue that because of what you've done in your career over the past 20 years or so, words like white privilege are now in the public domain. I mean, you have people writing about that. You have people writing about white privilege, and it's right at the time that you and I met was when the time that white privilege was sort of percolating in the academic world. I'm sure you remember all this that was going on, but it really hadn't hit the public domain. But as a result of your efforts and others along the way, you've given voice to a very significant part of the conundrum of what it means to be Black in America and what it means to struggle as a result of white folks not recognizing that they have this invisible knapsack they carry around that is so damn toxic, toxic, regardless of the environment that we're in, whether it be in higher education, whether it be raising children of color, it's toxic. And so when white folks gain an awareness of that, it can be transformative for them. it's like an aha moment when they get it. I've seen the light bulb go off in many people over the years. It's a beautiful thing to see. We need to see more light bulbs go off,
Yeah,
right?
let me
So that I'm not having to do it all the time, and you are not having to do it all the time, because it takes a lot of energy to do it.
Well, let me go there because I want to pick up on that topic. I appreciate you giving some love and acknowledgement. That means a lot, and it's always important to have people in support of your work, especially as you know, 20 years ago. Not only was this topic relatively new, the resistance that I received was relatively high. Not that that's changed a lot, but it does feel better to know that there's more and more of subject matter, publications, so on and so forth. Um, what I want to ask you about really is often when people talk about their cities and what's going on, particularly in the urban areas, they talk about the struggle of those who are in the most need, particularly, you know, folks of color, Black folks, even more specifically. What I was wondering as you were talking is, what's it like to be white? Like, how has white supremacy, white privilege shown up, manifested itself in Memphis, and how is that different from what you experienced in Utah? Is whiteness, white privilege, white supremacy, elements of oppression around those topics different in those two areas? As you talked about how, you know, the neighborhood in Utah can be very different than the neighborhood in Memphis. So what about whiteness, white supremacy? What have you noticed in the differences, the similarities in reference to that topic in those two areas that you've lived and done your work?
It's a good question. Utah, as I mentioned before, is sort of sanitized. So in the sanitization of whiteness in Utah really revolves around the Mormon church. The Mormon faith is a sort of catalyst for that. And what I mean by that is that the Mormon faith has this sort of idea of this sort of white savior mentality, right? So we're going to save the natives, we're going to save those who are oppressed, and so on. We're going to bring them Christianity, much like it was done in the early 1700s. I mean, it's the same kind of a thing. So when you see racism or white supremacy being performed, so we're talking about a system that's sort of superfluous. It's a larger system that culminates, that impacts the way we see culture, the way we see mainstream America, the music that we buy, the movies that we consume, the notions that we believe around images of beauty and what have you, all stem from a larger system of white supremacy, how white people have sort of set up a system which benefits them. And I want to be clear about who I'm talking about. I'm talking primarily about white elite men, elite white men who have the power and the resources to create a society in their own image. And often that meant excluding women, Native Americans, African Americans, anybody that was considered poor. Even the poor were ostracized in a world that was created by elite white men. When I say elite white men, I'm talking about men and their families, but primarily wealthy men who came from England and Europe to settle this country in the 1600s. They came here with something. Some were attorneys, some had professions when they got here, and they were able to take what they had and build their personal playground, which is the United States. The United States was initially set up to be just like any other British colony, a place where so-called settlers went, checked out the environment. Y'all got gold. Y'all got, and simply exploited the resources of the land and the people to get gain. So that's the legacy. So when you look at religious theology and religious discourse, you see similarities there as well. You see a sort of a Christianizing ethos, right? That my goal is to bring the heathen, right, i.e. Black people, Latinos, whoever the heathen are branded as, into the greater fold of God. So you've got a very sweet, syrupy performance of whiteness in Utah, right? Whereas in the South, you have a much more rough, bastardized, in your face version of white supremacy that plays out here in Memphis. The difference being that in Utah, people are very nice and very naively ignorant, if the word I want to use, very naive and very ignorant. I would say that Mormons would be the one step above Southern evangelicals. And the reason why I would say that is because Mormons tend to be very uh, uh, sweet and syrupy about their position on race. It might surprise your audience that I succumbed. I drank the Kool-Aid. I joined the Mormon Church when I was 15 years old in Nashville, and served the Mormon mission. I went to Michigan on my Mormon mission for 2 years. Learned all about Jesus and learned about how to talk to white people about God. Um, got the door slammed in my face quite a few times. I had a wake up call in Michigan too, Eddie. I was in Kalamazoo, and we were doing missionary. I'm sure you all have seen missionaries walk around with the white shirt on. You're not seeing many of them now because of COVID-19, but before that, they're all over the place, riding their bicycles with their helmets on or with a suit and a tie. You can tell they got a little placard on the coat. That was me. I remember being in Kalamazoo, man, and this brother, we had knocked on the door to these two college students' dorm room, and the brother opened the door, and we said, "Hi, we're missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ." In my cornball voice, "Hi, we're missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have a message to share with you about the restored gospel." And the people go, "Oh, come on in. Come on in. I want to talk to you." So we sit down. This brother, highly educated brother, commenced to tell me about how the church, the Mormon church, at one time discriminated against Black people, didn't allow Blacks to participate in the church, denied Black men the priesthood, which is the priesthood in the Mormon faith is synonymous with the priesthood in the Catholic Church. Everything revolves around the priesthood. And men, that is a man's domain, a man's bastion. Don't mess with the man's priesthood. Okay, it's what makes the man the man. So he and I said to he said, "Well, don't you know your church?" This is a college kid talking to another college age kid, right? Who was seemingly clueless about all this history of Mormon faith. So he's telling me about, "Did you know your church used to believe that Blacks were devils and that Black people had horns and tails and I was just dumbfounded. I was like, no, I don't. Nobody ever told me that I had a horn and a tail." But as we began to talk about this topic, and as my mind began to sort of come alive with the discussion, I went home and started to look at it. Went back to the room with my companion. I started to study this stuff and understand what exactly the hell I'm doing and what I'm trying to teach. That's when the aha moment came for me. And so, being that although I had not had any experiences in the Mormon faith where people called me out my name, I don't remember anything like that happening to me. People were very nice. I felt very, at least in Nashville, when I was going to my church in the Mormon faith in Nashville, I felt very accepted. I felt a part of the families that were in the ward that I belonged to. I felt that the people there really cared for me. And I think they did. I think they were responsible for, I think a lot of those folks there are responsible for who I became today in an offshoot sort of way, in the sense that they exposed me to things that I wasn't exposed to, like education. I wasn't a very good student in high school. I barely graduated. What got me through was football, I believe. So I remember when I was trying to graduate from high school, I was saying, all my friends were going off to college. They were like, "Where you going, Darron?" So I don't know what I'm gonna do. Maybe I don't know. I have no idea. Why don't you go to Rick's College? Rick's College is now BYU, Idaho. And so this is in the 80s, late 80s. I'm 18, 19 years old, and I graduate from high school. And my mother says, "Bubba, we going to California. We moving back to California." It's my nickname, Bubba. We going back to California. I don't know what you're gonna do. You can stay here and live with grandma and grandpa, or you can, come with us to California. I said, "No, I'm gonna go to Rick's College," because I had nowhere else to go. So I'm gonna go to Rick's College. And my homie in my ward who went to my high school, he told me about Rick's College, and I said, "Well, I don't have good grades." And he said, "Well, they'll take anybody at Rick's. They don't matter what grades you have. They'll help you get your grades better." And so I said, "Okay." So my mother gave me $200. That's all we had. Put me on a Greyhound bus homie, from Nashville to Idaho.
Yeah.
That was an experience, going from there, from Nashville to Idaho. And just the landscape changed, everything changed. The landscape changed. I wasn't used to seeing that part of the world. The people changed. I saw Native Americans, and I was like, had no idea. And when I got to the area, it became apparent that the white people in the area weren't used to seeing a black person. They never saw a black person in the flesh. They saw black people on TV, but not in the flesh. So that was an interesting experience for me, man. I mean, geez. So, I would say that the differences between those two, the two places would be, one, here in Memphis, you've got the history of the Union Army and the history of slavery in this community. You have the boldness of white folks here, and you have storied Black resistance from day one. It's since the time that the Blacks came into the region, and the soldiers came here, and the slaves came in this region, and we have what we have today. In Utah, you have a lot of transplants that have come there simply because of the Mormon Church. The Blacks that are in Utah, a lot of them are there because of the Mormon faith, one, and two, because of the railroad, the Ogden Railroad system that was built during the first half of the 2nd century. So the differences are striking.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, because I've spent a little time in Utah just recently. I'm hoping to get a gentleman that I met there, who you may even actually know, Curtis Linton.
That's my dude, my dog.
Yeah, Curtis is doing some great work, as you know, around transracial adoption, which is what I want to ask you about next, because when you talk about and describe what's happened or what's a part of the Mormon Church, although I think we can both say that there's been some evolution, but still this syrupy savior. And I'm wondering, how does a kid of color experience that in an adopted home? What I learned while I was in Utah, some of the fastest growing populations of people of color are coming through adoption,
right,
into white homes of kids of color. Some, globally, but even some domestically. So I'm wondering just what you've seen, what you've experienced, and is it even safe for a Black kid in these kinds of homes? As you talked about trauma earlier. So I wanna ask you that. I got a follow-up to that, so we got to get more concise in our responses, because I got like 8 more questions for you here, Doc.
Now you gotta hold me in, brother. Hold me in.
And so our time is short, so I want to get a series of questions in. First, is it safe in these homes based on what you talked about? How is this transracial adoption of Black kids, of kids of color, playing out in Utah as you've seen it, experienced it, researched it, from your expertise?
Well, it's are kids safe there? I would say it depends on how you define safety. Physical safety, yes. I mean, Utah is as safe as any, as safe as any white bastion you'll find in the country. It's extremely safe there. If it's safety in terms of, safe for my development, my psychological development, it depends on the family you end up with. Some families in Utah who have transracially adopted children, this is true all over the country with transracial adoptees, but not just in Utah, but in particular, we're focusing on them. When parents deny or downplay a kid's racial identity development, it can lead to significant psychological problems for the child. So when a kid is curious about their and typically it starts with young children, it starts with, why is my skin different from yours? That's the first thing. Why does mine look different from yours? And when parents don't have any response to that, or anything that they prepared to it leaves the kid really, really lacking for, well, where does that leave me? Kids see themselves through their parents. They're able to have a sense of identity by watching their parents primarily. And the elephant in the room is the kid who's living in the white home, right? And so when the parents ignore it, when the kid comes home from school and says, somebody called me the N-word, and I don't know what that means, but everybody started laughing at me. And the parents say, oh, just ignore that. This is a foolish kid, just ignore that. That is another micro assault. We're talking about microaggressions. You know that very well. Microaggressions would be these insults, these slights, these name calling, hair touching, these things that sort of that are corrosive to someone's identity, someone's sense of self. So when parents don't address that, then these kids grow up extremely confused. In fact, what got me interested in the topic of transracial adoption was teaching at BYU and teaching at Utah Valley State College, as it was called then. It's called Utah Valley University now. And I would have these Black kids in my class, Eddie, and they would come to my class, and we would be talking about things like, for instance, blacks in the priesthood. That was one of the areas I spoke about in my courses. And they would take the position of the white folks. You're speaking out of turn. You're critiquing the prophet. You shouldn't be saying those things. I'm like, these things are in history. Read your history, right? So the Black folks are telling me this. They're just as pissed off about it as white folks are. I'm like, something ain't wrong with this. Something ain't right with this story. Now, after the first couple of years, I kind of like ignored it. I was like, well, maybe this is just an aberration. But when it kept happening, I said, let me go talk to somebody. Let me ask one person. So I asked this one young lady who's in my class about this. I said, what's your background? Where are you from? You know, I was adopted by a white family. I was like, oh, really? Interesting. So that's what sort of got me interested in this, is how these children were being raised. They look like you and I, but their sensibilities are like Utahns. They're conservative, they're syrupy sweet. They have no sense of identity development. And that's the problem, is that I understand that the parents are trying to say, well, I want to raise my kid to be colorblind. That is not a good strategy. The world doesn't see them as colorblind. The world doesn't see them that way. They see them as Black and all of the stereotypical notions that are associated with being Black. So parents have an obligation to teach their children about Blackness, even though they may not be very good at it. So one of the things I recommend parents do is I recommend that they completely commit racial treason by abandoning all vestiges of whiteness, right? To move into a Black space, to get a greater array of friends that look like their children, not just for some trite reason, but to really make the effort to get to know Black people, to get to understand Black people. That helps. You another comment you want to?
Yeah. Like I said, I got 7 more, Doc. I got 7 more for you.
Go ahead.
What you made me think of, and what I wanted to ask you about, maybe somewhat jokingly, but somewhat seriously. Thank you. We definitely want to hear more about some of your resources, so we'll get back to that. So put them all there, stack them all up, because we'll let you flash them up. But I was going to say, maybe we need to do a Black boot camp for some of these white parents, where they spend a week just saturated. But what I was going to ask seriously, though, is being in Memphis, my assumption is there's not so much transracial adoptions, but multiracial families, white moms,
Yes.
Black kids. Is that different? Do you see that differently than what happens with transracially adopted kids?
I don't, because I see it the same, because the primary caregiver in these homes are usually white moms. So the white mothers are going to raise their children in white middle class ways. That's just what they know how to do. I mean, it's not some conspiracy that they're harboring. It's just, that's what they know. They default to what they know. So these parents are raising their children to be socially white Black people. Okay. And that, in this community, you know all about, man, kids being called, man, you white boy, Einstein, or whatever they call them. They mock Black kids who sound white, right? And what does it mean to sound white? It means you don't have an accent, right? You don't speak with slang, or you don't have an accent, right? You sound more white, like people are trying to clown the Surgeon General, Jerome, whatever his name is, Ball, or whatever his name, the guy's name, trying to clown him about his experiences as well. So the similarities between both communities, Eddie, is the parents. So who's doing the primary caregiving in the home? It's the white mothers primarily. So children, whether they're raised in transracially adopted homes or raised by their birth parents, are still being socialized into whiteness.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, because you had Black parents.
Yes.
But you talk like the Surgeon General when you went to
Who,
do
me?
some recruiting back
Who,
in the
me?
day.
Yes.
Yeah. So what I'm wondering is, for those of us educated in predominantly white institutions, have you seen that there's a difference as far as the impact that that kind of environment may have on them, even though they come from Blackness, so to speak, a Black foundation? And secondly, for you, Doc, how long do you feel it took you to kind of counter that conditioning of whiteness? As you look at yourself now, it seems that you have a sound, solid foundation from essentially what I would argue possibly some trauma experience at the hands of white supremacy whiteness. How would you respond to that?
I think anybody who's Black in America has experienced trauma, racial trauma. It's just you can't survive. You can't live in this society and not have that. So I say that, you know, like Du Bois talks about in many of his writings, it took him 20 years to unlearn his education that he received at Harvard, right? And I think that's sort of kind of where I am. I mean, I'm always unlearning these incredible foundational narratives around the body, around what it means to be an American, what it means to be a racialized American, and what have you. I'm always uncovering these processes. But it took me to be exposed to literature. It took me to be exposed to brothers like you. In fact, let me give you an example. In Utah, when I was in Utah, to get me through college, I taught aerobics, hip hop aerobics, step aerobics, you name it. I was that dude, man. I had 100 people in my class. Music was pumping. I mean, I made some good coin doing that too when I was out there. Part of that had to do with the exoticism of being a Black male teaching an aerobics class in a predominantly white community. So I realized that there was some exoticism going on there too, but I worked it nonetheless. And in that experience, there was a brother that used to always come to my class. He was always going to my class. He didn't hardly say anything, but he would show up to my class and do the thing. Then one day after the class, he comes up to me and says, "Hey man, my name is Wilfred Sam," because I never really said anything. I was kind of a shy dude or whatever. My name is Wilfred Sam. And maybe I had some Black self-hatingness too going on. I just don't know. I mean, probably so at the time. He said, "Man, you never talk to me, man. You always talk to these white folk, but you never talk to me." Ooh, that was like a dagger in the heart. Oh. And so we started talking more. Come to find out, he taught at the University of Utah. And as it turned out, he was the director of African American Studies. So that was meeting Dr. Wilfred Samuels is his name. He recently passed, by the God rest his soul, recently passed. But he was the one that really cast a big ass light on me when it came to understanding political understandings, racial. I mean, I had no idea. And then here's the other part that kind of came with this. The reason why Samuels is an interesting character in this. At the time, I was living in Provo, and I had a colleague down at BYU who asked me, "Would you be interested in teaching a course at BYU in the honors department? What's the course? African American Experience course. You can teach it however you want to." Now, granted, I don't have a master's degree. I'm barely getting my bachelor's degree, right? BYU just hires me off the street to teach this course. I could have known nothing. I knew a lot more coming in than I did going out. So when I got the job, the first person I called was Wilfred. I said, "Wilfred, I got this job at BYU teaching this course. I have no idea it's about the African American experience." So he said, "Let me tell you what, I'm gonna school you on this." So we took a whole summer and I read a ton of stuff, and then had many conversations with Wilfred. Then the class launched in the fall, and Wilfred came down and taught for me numerous times. And so I owe a lot of my pedagogy and my teaching experiences to Wilford, and for casting a light on the ignorance that was seductively, it was seductive. It's I was sort of sucked into it. It's like drinking the Kool-Aid and realizing that the white man's Kool-Aid doesn't taste any better than the black man's Kool-Aid. So that was a good experience for me, is to be essentially called out by my colleague, my friend and colleague.
Yeah. Thank you, Doc. I appreciate you sharing that. And that 20-year framework, I mean, seems so daunting, but it's just good to have a sense of knowing it takes some time, particularly coming from a scholar and a person like Du Bois. Let me ask you about white teachers, Black students, Black boys specifically, because it's not quite parenting, but it's kind of parenting when you think about the number of hours they spend there. And it feels like there are these similar kinds of dynamics you mentioned around what happens in the homes of white parents when they're Black kids could be also happening in the classroom. What's your sense of the state of the white teacher and some of the challenges ahead when it comes to students of color, kids of color, particularly young Black males?
In public education, you mean?
Private education. I think the numbers are the same, but particularly K-12 in the most vulnerable ages, I would ask you to think about.
Sure. I would say, if in regards to young Black men, we know that, the nation has a historical, the nation historically has casted Black men as being dangerous, other, sexual predator, criminal, thug, you name it. There's a host of stereotypes that we all know well as Black men, and the way in which white folks see us. Those stereotypes and notions of the mind remain intact. When children of color cross the threshold into schools, sadly, they are looked at by teachers, primarily white teachers, but also Black teachers do it as well. But the majority of teachers teaching in public education these days are white teachers. I think 80%, 89% of school teachers are white women. And so they bring with them the white sensibilities that they gathered from home and their circumstances. And so when they encounter young Black boys, particularly young Black boys in school who have behavioral problems, they can't sit still. They interrupt during the class discussions. They stand up and can't sit down. They're wiggly and squirmy. They're squirmy. They can't sit still in their chair. These kinds of things. Then that makes the typecasting of Black men Black boys even more acute in public schools. So I would argue that when young Black boys come into start their schooling experiences when they're 5 or 6 years old, that's the beginning of a toxic relationship between the public education system and the young boys of color, simply because young men of color have been so marginalized within that space. I'm sure your listeners have heard of the school to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline is real. And what's making it real is the perceptions and ideas of teachers who are engaging with these young boys. Remember, a lot of white folks don't have any significant friends of color. They don't. I mean, go to any of your white friends' Facebook pages and look on their Facebook page. You're gonna see an abundance of primarily white people. Whereas if you go to Black people's pages or even Latinos pages, you're gonna see a scattering of different multi-ethnic friends that they have. So white folks remain the most segregated group in the country then and today, in their lack of friendships and associations that they have with people of color outside of the classroom, outside of the workplace, and outside of the religious institutions that they attend. So there's a crisis there in the sense that Blacks know white folks better than white folks know themselves, but white folks certainly don't know the Black experience. What they know of it is what they see in popular culture.
Yeah. So, Doc, as we look at the landscape of challenges ahead, I mean, what's happening now with this pandemic, this quarantine time, I'm wondering, I mean, what's your sense of how people are doing? I mean, maybe right there in Memphis as you spend most of your time, but even in your network, what's your sense of how people are doing, particularly when it relates to, as you talked about, one of your areas of specialty psychologically? and what's on the horizon for you? We got about 10 more minutes, so I want to just get you to respond quickly, how you think people
Okay.
are doing as a whole, and then what's up next for you as you look at, let's say, the next 10 years of your work, research,
Okay.
and what you're planning to do.
I think people here are, I don't know within individual families, but I can say that given our area, the degree of poverty in our area, people are struggling, man. They are struggling. And people have retreated inside the homes where they're supposed to be. Some have, at least the majority of people here in the city have. So what I was expecting to see is an uptick in domestic violence reports, an uptick in abuse. When people get boxed up in the same homes for extended periods of time, it can be psychologically toxic as well. But what we're seeing in the numbers here in Memphis, I saw it the other day, this time last year, we had 200 and almost 1,200 or some odd domestic violence reports, and we're slightly down this year. But I think that's the calm before the storm. So I really do believe that there is a tsunami of mental health problems that will emerge as a result of COVID. The aftermath of COVID, having to be socially exercise social distancing, and also the degree of which people are dying, and the relationships that people are losing critical relationships given the veracity of COVID. So I would say that in the future, what I'm looking for is, I've talked a lot about systemic issues. Most of my research has been looking at large systemic issues that impact Black Americans and other Americans of color. Now I'm looking at smaller micro interventions that impact upon the stress response that people of color often feel when they are having to work in hostile environments or attend schools. I'm looking at what's called brain research, or what's called neurofeedback therapy. Neurofeedback therapy involves reconditioning brain networks inside of our head responsible for performance, like affect, happy, sad, frustrated, emotions, helping us to regulate our emotions better using very sophisticated computer technology to be able to form a 3D mapping of the brain. And with that 3D mapping of the brain in real time, actually, you can see areas of dysregulation in the networks responsible for attention, focus, sadness, impulsivity, and you can target these areas using incredible technology known as EEG technology, putting electrodes on the brain. My brain, my shiny head, has invisible electrical signals flowing from it. So I put electrodes on my brain to listen to what these signals, where the signals are coming from, and the frequency, the brain frequencies in which they're firing. And from that, I can create a protocol to train people who are traumatized, for instance, to have less symptoms of being traumatized. And what's kind of cool about neurofeedback is that it facilitates a phenomenon known as synaptogenesis, where you create new synapses in the brain that you didn't have before. And those new synapses are what facilitate performance. And why am I doing this? I'm doing it because I think that African Americans and other communities of color have been extremely traumatized growing up in a racist society. So some people liken it to PTSD. So what neurofeedback therapy does is it helps the brain to down-regulate the emotional stressors that get our fight or flight system working overtime, so that people can't sleep at night, they're more anxious, they're more angry, they're more irritable, and what have you. And so I'm finding that to be a very, very fruitful endeavor for the next 10 years, is teaching Black folks and other marginalized communities how to regulate their emotions, so that when some idiot calls them the N-word or some other inflammatory epithet, rather than react in anger, they can learn to sort of let it go, learn to let it go. So that's what I'm working on now for the next 10 years.
That's powerful. Last thing I want to ask you, just a fun fact question. What are you watching? What show, what stream, what have you watched that's helped you learn some stuff, but also, have you seen something lately that you could suggest, whether it's a show or movie, that just allows you to disconnect for a little while?
Man, I've been doing a lot of binge watching. You know,
Give me a couple
I'm
favorites.
trying. Let me see. Mainstream TV. We watch some of those singing shows that are on TV right now. Songland, or the other one. I can't remember one. I can't remember the ones that are on. And the movies, man, I can't really remember that though. I mean, I don't really watch a whole lot of, TV too much, terribly too much. So I can't really speak to that with any kind of degree of certainty. I will say that if people want to watch a video, they should watch. Curtis Linton has a video out that revolves around this issue of transracial adoption. You know that Curtis Linton's video? Okay. So if people who are listening to this podcast and they want to know more about transracial adoption in terms of what happens to children and families, that would be a good place to start. And the name of the video slips my mind, so perhaps we can put a link to it somewhere in the body of this particular.
Yeah, we will.
So.
We'll check it out. This show is not around that issue, but I do think it deals a lot around possibly some of what we experience when we're confined into an environment and literally at times forced to adjust. And we can make a decision if we stay that way or if that's not us. And that's what this show had me thinking about, even though it was so far away from my personal experience. And so I recommend it. I'm recommending it to friends and colleagues. So I would suggest you check it out. Let me know what you think. It's called Unorthodox.
Unorthodox.
And it's on Netflix. If you have a chance, have a friend, I'll let you borrow an episode. But check it out, Doc, and let me know what you think. And see if it does have any connection to some of that kind of experience we've all had to go through when we're battling, adjusting, and finding out who we are, and assimilation, and the real you. And it just had me thinking about a lot of that. Listen, I appreciate you.
Man, it's a pleasure to be here. It really is. And I was going to make mention to this. I had mentioned this earlier for your audience. This is a book called White Parents, Black Children, Experiencing Transracial Adoption. It's been a few years since I wrote this one. So this is a really good book that gets into this topic that we're talking about. And you mentioned the idea of contemplating maybe having a Black boot camp for these children. I think that would be fantastic. I think there are a lot of transracial adoption groups across the country who are doing this, who are doing what you're suggesting. But it's not the same. It's not the same. If it were people of color involved, I think it would make a much bigger impact on young people. So I think the take-home message for me is that racism is seriously debilitating. It's like a mental health disorder. It's like having PTSD, particularly when you routinely exposed to exposed to the ugliness of it. So I would say, if you are feeling symptomatic or, you have symptoms, tearfulness, anger, frustration, low frustration tolerance, you can't sleep at night, those kinds of things, it might be a sign of trauma. Might want to consider it.
Yeah.
Getting help.
Well, Doc, we will post that resource. You can email me some others, and we'll definitely put your website, which is full of some great information as well. And again, I appreciate you, man, not only for being here, but always supporting me and my work. And we'll let you know when you're going to air. And you be safe out there in Memphis, man, and give my love to the fam, and we'll be in touch.
Indeed. Thank you, brother. Take care.
Peace. Peace.
Peace.